So those of you who talk Southern will understand him probably better than us Northern. LeGreer, our IT specialist, is from South Carolina. She can talk Southern. North Carolina, I'm sorry. Ooh.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah.
So anyway, Scott is the president and CEO of the Holston Medical Group. When I got started in the ACOs, we found that the Holston Medical Group was one of those that they made reference to as the ACO. So it was called Qualuable at that time, I think.
Yep,
and so it's a great privilege for us to have three of the staff there. We're going to start with Dr. Fowler, and then I'll introduce the next two in a little bit, so when it's their time. So he's wired twice, once for video and once for the rest of you all. I can say y'all.
Yeah,
I guess that's as close as I can get.
We
All
understand.
right,
We
so
understand you guys too. So
okay,
yeah.
very good.
All right, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction, and it's really an honor for me to be here. I can't tell you how important it is for me to get to stand in front of groups of doctors that are sort of trying to take the position that the patient comes first. And I think these ACO models give us the opportunity to do that. I know we all went to become doctors with that in our minds, and the systems that we work in sometimes distract us somewhat from that. So this is a real opportunity to get back to that. I'm Scott Fowler. I am the CEO of Holston Medical Group. I am a practicing OBGYN. Probably about 10 years ago, we started the process of trying to figure out how to move from a really fee-for-service model where we felt like we were running on hamster wheels. We weren't getting anywhere. Our patients were having some things happen to them that we couldn't really control, to a model where we really had the data pieces that we needed. And we knew inside our group, which was a multi-specialty group, that if we had a common patient record, we could really make a difference. If we were referring in a place where we really knew where the things were going, if we could bring back, in a sense, the sort of old school sidewalk consult kind of model that helps doctors communicate with each other about their care model. So from that, we built an ACO, which was referred to as Qualuable, and we'll talk about today about a lot of the things that were in our path as we move through this and how we achieved success in that. And you'll hear some of that story. The ACO model is now, as you know, all of you know, it's finished with its first 2 rounds for the people that started in 2013, excuse me, and it's going to this new glide path model, so I want to spend some time talking about that as well. With me are Wesley Combs. He's actually the president of the IT infrastructure, and today the topic is the pillars of success, and we think there are 3 fundamental pillars that you have to have in place. They do have an order of importance. We'll talk about that a little bit, but this idea of a common patient record is a critical first sort of understanding of how you move from a fee-for-service model to a fee-for-value model, which is what we really have to do. That's what's in front of us. So, also Samantha Sizemore. We all sort of represent a pillar. If you think about sort of my pillar is the mission and the goal and how do we sort of accomplish the bigger pictures. You think about the IT infrastructure as the communication pieces, how do we communicate, collaborate, and then Samantha is our COO is about how do we actually operationalize these things. And I know she's been working with many of you, so that's the crew that's here today. I want to take you back to 1980 for a minute, because this is not new. This business about value and fee-for-service and what needs to change in our system didn't just happen. It's been there for a while, and we've known about it. It's part and parcel to the fee-for-service model that we sort of have gone the way we've gone. So let me talk just a little bit about this. This New England Journal of Medicine, 1980, raised the issue that fee-for-service creates problems of overuse and fragmentation of care. And of course, in 1980, it was just really beginning to become obvious that that fee-for-volume model had some consequences to it that were not particularly good for patients. They were also concerned at this time that it was becoming such a big it was beginning to develop into a kind of medical industrial complex between pharmacy and payers, and it was really moving the relationships of the patients away from doctors and into relationships with a lot of other pieces of the puzzle that were causing fragmentation. So they were worried it may exercise undue influence over national policy and certainly over cost. And there was a call to action in this 1980 article. Now, there were other articles, but this was the editor of JAMA at that time was really focused on the idea that this was a critical piece. Can everybody hear me okay? My voice doesn't always carry. Microphone's working okay. He basically said, look, physicians, in this medical market, physicians specifically, must, as leaders of this, must act as discerning purchasing agents for their patients and therefore should have no conflicting financial interests, meaning that we really have to watch ourselves as a profession and to a certain degree, identified professionalism as one of the pieces of the puzzle that has to be in place. And then closer attention from the public and the profession and study and piloting and understanding are necessary to ensure that this sort of new threat to healthcare in America was met. So this is actually him quoting the editor. If we're to live comfortably with the new medical industrial complex, we must put our priorities in order. The needs of the patients and society come first. How best to ensure the medical industrial complex serves the interest of patients first and of its stockholders second will have to be the responsibility of the medical profession and an informed public. And so this was the call to arms, 1980. There also was a big discussion going on at the time about this concept of profit versus nonprofit, because HCA, the big hospital system, was becoming powerful, and there was a lot of worry that the for-profit systems were somehow going to have a different mission than the nonprofits. And it was recognized that in the end, distinguishing not-for-profit from for-profit does not change the profit motivation in the system. And we see that definitely in the new rules that have come out from CMS and the new data that we're seeing. So they did kind of try to deal with the issue of what was going on there. This is a chart that shows two really important things, I think. One is that higher cost worsens outcome, meaning that in American healthcare, we've run past the idea that if you pay more for something, you get something better. We actually have gone past the place where you can just add $1 and get something better, and we've gone to a place where if you add $1, you actually get something worse. And I think that's a shocking realization from the data that we're actually spending more to get worse outcomes, but it's absolutely clear in the data. If you look here at 1980, which is when JAMA came out, let's see if I can do it right here. Yeah, so that's pretty good. You can see that at this point, actually, there was an improvement. This is life expectancy, which is a common way to kind of look at overall impact. And then, of course, the dates down here, and these are females and males compared to really all the developed nations in the world. And you can see that America, which is the top line here at about 1980, is really above where everybody else is doing. And the bottom line's pretty close. And you see from 1980 on, there really is a drop, and it's significant. And by the time you get to 2010, you see life expectancy of Americans really dropping off. And this isn't life expectancy because we have immigrants that are poor or any of that. I think those are important problems. You can just take a cohort of middle-class white Americans and compare them across the board, and this is what you see. Okay, and it's more than just healthcare, but it's recognized here. On the right side is the other important sort of central concept of this whole structure, and that is that as people age and as complexity increases, our healthcare system does a worse job of managing them. And you can imagine if you have complex things to manage and you have fragmented models that manage them in silos, you're going to have that happen. And that is the sort of trademark of this problem. Less than 4 chronic conditions, so you can be pretty sick in America, and actually we do great. We do pretty well. That's because the family practice docs and the guys that are really the people that are really taking care of the patients actually manage a huge amount of complexity very well. But if you pop over the top of that complexity and you go to 4+ chronic conditions, that's where all the spend is, and that's because they fall through the cracks and they end up in high-cost settings. Okay. This is what the government is looking at. So if you want to really just say, I got to take a couple of messages away about what the government's thinking, you can look at this chart and you can see pretty clearly where they are and where they're going. This is, for the government, it's an actuarial problem. It's a problem about cost per patient that they have to take care of under their insurance program. So if you look at the United States, where we are today, over here, let's see if I can get that off okay. Sorry about that. You can see that we're back in 2013 when this slide was made, we were at about $9,000 per capita spending for healthcare. And we had a life expectancy that we should have been spending $3,000 per life on to get. If you then look directly up to where we ought to be for the spend that we have, you see the different idea of what's going on here. Fee-for-service is moving us out to the right, so it's not increasing life expectancy, but it is increasing cost. And fee-for-value is pushing us up on the screen to make us equal with everybody else. And that's what they're thinking when they're thinking fee-for-value and fee-for-service. They're thinking that fee-for-service is going to have to stop and stay flat, and that fee-for-value is going to have to take the place of it to move us to this top line. So, by the way, 2016, 10,348, 2017, 10,758. It's just marching down the road. And that's why when it comes to the question of, gee whiz, is this inevitable? Is this, we put it off now for a few years, could we put it off for a few years longer? You can see that the actuarial numbers are going to drive what's in the new CMS proposed rule for the ACO to about a 3-year movement to risk. And that's going to be in law. It's really already in law, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. I want to say one other thing, because our real issue with complex care is not that we don't do it. It's that it ends up in very high-cost settings. So when patients get above about 4 chronic diseases, and I can tell you a lot of other things that have to do with this aging population, that ends up in the highest cost setting that you can end up in when there actually are lower cost alternatives to it. And that's part of the fragmented system that we have. But you can see, compared to every other country in the world, these are all the developed countries down here. Everybody starts going up about age 60. It's just harder to take care of people. It costs more money. But we start going up much, much faster. And it's because we have siloed, fragmented services, and we have high prices in some of those services. So. And then just the last point I want to make, and I'm trying to set the stage for what we're going to try to do and make sure we're all on the same mission plan here and understand sort of the basic facts. This is Medicare population as it expands. So for each one of these patients, the government's now picking up $10,000 to $11,000 worth of cost. 2015, we were smack at the 55 million right there. And so in 2020, I suspect we'll be at 63. In 2025, 72. It just looks like that's the way it's going to be. It's an almost exponential increase in the government's cost because of these rising enrollment numbers. Okay. Yes, sir.
2 graphs previous.
Yes.
Is there some doubt on what seems to be why our high-cost centers are so much higher cost than other areas? Is it facilities? Has there been some more?
It's probably that they developed a Part A and a Part B early on in our Medicare process, and then in 1980 we started seeing these sort of profit-centered approaches rather than patient-centric approaches. That drove a lot of the work into Part A, which was a much higher reimbursement model than Part B. It caused the Part A systems to try to buy up the Part B systems and expand their market share. It's the economics of that sort of industrial complex, and the fact that our system, from the beginning, we were only providing in-hospital insurance, and then we added this Part B insurance to it, and that's why we have much higher prices. If you go to a hospital-based diagnostic center, it's 40% more costly for Medicare, and they're going to fix that, but they haven't fixed it yet.
Internationally, is there a large disparity between primary care salary billing charges versus specialty, or is the U.S. far more disparate in that than other?
No, if you look at it as a function of education and GDP, so if you compare GDP and you compare the educational requirements, in other words, if I take a doctor in America and I say, well, if they weren't a doctor, what would they have made? Doing something else that's equivalent to their sort of education and profession. We're pretty much right on target with where most nations are. It's just most nations solve some of the problems around pricing much differently than we do. You know, they really do go in and do the things, and the forces involved in this in America are pretty significant. I mean, we spend 3 times as much as most nations in the world on our health care, and we get we get some spectacular results. We get the most responsive system in the world. I mean, if you have a heart attack, you want to be here. If you need a stent, you want to be here. I mean, there are things that we do well. It's just in the overall course of things, it doesn't move the needle that much compared to other countries. So that's the setting, and now we get to the sustained growth rate. And y'all remember this law. It was in place. They kicked the can down the road every year. And what it basically was a law that said if the doctors spend more money than what we're predicting they should spend, we're going to penalize them for it. It was a Part B only program. So basically what they did was they said, we're going to monitor doctors, and every year we're going to adjust down the fee schedule if they don't reach certain things. And it got all the way to 23% or 25% or something, right? Because they couldn't really do that. I mean, they couldn't really reduce the cost. The doctors are already running on the hamster wheel to figure out how to take care of Medicare. There's no real way to do that. But they knew that the doctors ultimately had the power and ability to affect the system if they would. So they were trying to put pressure on them. Didn't work. SGR, ran out until just recently, and MACRA and MIPS, well, MACRA is the replacement for the SGR. It was about a 23 to 25% reduction in fee schedule. And the actuarials just plugged it into MIPS and MACRA. That downward adjustment is already in the law. They just took the actuarial rate and just moved it over to a new program. So let's talk a little bit about what this is. Obviously, it repealed the SGR and replaced it with MIPS. MIPS works by NPI number. It's personal to you as a doctor, okay? And basically what it does is it adds your total Part A and Part B cost up, even though it's a Part B only program. It monitors your Part A and your Part B spend. This is not good for doctors that are in high Part A programs or have a lot of patients spend a lot of money in Part A, but they did it on purpose. And then they use a metric that includes cost. So it has other things. You guys all know it has ACI and it has improvement of care and it has all these other metrics. But the cost metric is what the real differentiator in that is. And it rises every year. This year it's 10% of your MIPS score, and next year it'll be 20, and next year it'll be 30. That's very important for understanding why ACOs and APM models are things that might be of interest to doctors, and also why maybe changing your affiliations from hospital-based or Part A-based affiliations to non-Part A-based affiliations are important. Also remember there's a 2-year delay in MIPS, so you won't feel the score. This year we're feeling the first hit on MIPS. So, if you really were good and you did everything right, you might have gotten a 2% bump in your Medicare fee schedule this year, 2.2, whatever it was. If you really didn't do a good job, you might have not seen that bump. There weren't a lot of penalties in the early years, but next year will be different, and the year after that will be different. They're definitely going to follow this out. APMs are the other risk models. I know a lot of people have been in CPC Plus, which is an APM. Not if you're in an ACO, but if you're not in an ACO, it's an APM. APMs are good, but they are risk models, and they substantially follow the same metrics. There's not really any difference in the way you get judged. It's just that since you're at risk, the cost sections come out of your risk instead out of your score. APMs have about a 5% bonus structure in them for fee schedule adjustments every year, but they start from a flat fee schedule, which is not going to go up, and they bump it 5%. After about 2.5 years of inflation, that's 0%, because we have about a 2.5% inflation rate right now. So, the government's got to look at this. They have actuarials. They're looking at this from the point of view of we actually can only pay for so much and have it make sense in our system. So high spending, we'll see a flat to reduce fee schedule. That's going to happen over the next 3 to 5 years, pretty much on a linear scale. There is an exception for ACOs that are not APMs, and that exception is that cost does not go into your performance in ACOs. Just like in CPC Plus or any of the APMs, cost goes into your performance around cost. The only difference there is that in the other ones, you're locked into that 5% bonus structure, whereas in an ACO, if you're in MIPS, you're not locked into a 5%. You can get 9%, 18%, whatever it is that you perform to. So those are the exceptions, and we can talk. I know you'll have questions about that. So this is forcing an actuarial solution, and it's important for us to be on the same page. This is not, do we elect to be in, do we elect to be out? No matter where you go, you're in right now. And this is what they said in the final rule, and the final rule just came out. It was proposed the end of last year. I'm sure you guys have read it. It's 350 pages of legal mumbo jumbo. But the final rule does have some pretty clear messages. And I think they're bold messages, actually. So Medicare cannot afford to continue with models that are not producing desired results. So first thing they did was they said we had a lot of ACOs that didn't produce anything. Why didn't they produce anything? Because we're not going to keep doing that. We're going to do the ones that did produce something, we're going to adjust the program to make them produce. So they basically said the gaming of the system by trapping patients in ACOs that have no interest really in saving money, or maybe they have a conflict of interest with saving money, trapping those patient lives in those systems is going to stop. Those systems are going to go to risk way earlier, up to 3 years earlier than the systems that typically don't have that in it. The distinctions they made are this low revenue versus high revenue. That's the new thing that's in there. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, but as a general rule, low revenue ACOs are physician-run, physician-led ACOs, and the high revs generally include Part A expenses, so they tend to be inpatient type things. And then they said the presence of an upside-only track, meaning no downside risk, is encouraging consolidation. And what they mean here is that the hospitals are consolidating. They're using these ACO models to consolidate, not just the hospitals, the whole medical industrial complex, whether it's Optum or the hospitals or anything else, is sort of using these models that don't have downside risk to build very big platforms across huge populations. Okay. The goal of it is to create a pathway for success that facilitates ACO transition. So they have this 5-year plan, and it's a glide path. I just want to throw a few numbers out because you need some facts to wrap your head around why CMS is doing this. Or is this just an idea philosophy, or is this really something that has facts and proof in it already? So this is a study on total expenditures per patient, and it specifically looks at physician versus hospital-based ACOs. And cost of care per patient when seen by a physician practice owned by a multi-hospital. And multi-hospital is important. This isn't your little independent hospital down on the corner. This is a hospital that may have 15, 16 hospitals in it and growing, merging all the time. That system spend per doctor was $4,700, whereas the independents were at $3,000. That's about 35%, which you'll see later. This 35% number pops up in the proposed rule as well. So these things all tie together. Independent primary care ACOs created more cost savings than hospital integrated groups. And I don't want this to sound anti-hospital. I want you to understand that the complex of services that fragment care are what's really here. It's not that we don't love hospitals and need hospitals. We do, actually. They're an important part of the healthcare system. It's just they're being targeted in this because it's clear that the pricing model is moving our patients into high-price treatment. Acute care emergency department are the big ones there, makes up 55% of the cost for the high healthcare utilizing population. So emergency rooms and hospital inpatient service of patients that could have been taken care of in lower cost settings is the target. So here's the new distinctions in the proposed rule: experienced versus inexperienced. So less than 40% of participating TINs have been in a risk-sharing ACO. By the way, Track 1 is not a risk-sharing ACO yet. So it wasn't considered one of the risk-sharing ACOs. So if you've been in Track 1, you're not a risk TIN. Or if you've deferred, all of those going forward, all the basic tracks will be risk. But for now, everybody who's been in Track 1 is not part of a risk TIN. The reason they're doing this is because there's a lot of programs out there that do have risk in them, and they're not going to let them start over. They're not going to let them start at the beginning and get another 3-year run. They're going to make them go to risk, and if they can't do risk, they're going to make them get out of it, do something else, and let the ACOs that actually can do it get those patient lives. Low rev versus high, I told you about how that works. if you're Part B dominant, you probably spend less than 12% of the total spend on a patient. If you're Part A dominant, you probably spend more than 35, your revenue is probably more than 35% of the total spend, and that's the distinction there. And then new, renewing, and re-entering, for those of you that are coming into Emergent will be new. And the reason it'll be new is that less than 50% of our ACO participants have a history together in the same ACO, and that was done on purpose in order to allow groups to come together and build the platforms that they need. So this may be more painful than the CME you're getting, so y'all stop me if you I just throw this up there. I know you can't drink from a fire hose, but it's really important. The final rule improves some things that were in the original proposed rule. The original proposed rule, they were going to drop anybody who wasn't risk-bearing down to a 25% savings rate, part, and they moved it up to 40%. They capped it the same place it was. It was always 10%. And the rest of it's the same. If you go in at Basic A, you actually get July to January in Basic A, which is no downside risk. Then you get up to 3 years because you're allowed to add 1 year if you're a low-risk new ACO. So for Emergent, we would have up to 3 years. You can advance to one of these other tracks like C, D, and E, which all have risk involved in them, anytime you want. Anytime that you find out, my gosh, we can do this, we can take this risk, then you can go ahead and just tell them you want to advance. The high rev, low rev is about a loss cap. So if you're a high rev system, if you're in an ACO with say a big hospital system in it, they're going to count all the hospital's revenue against the calculation with the doctors that are in there to see if it's above 35% of the total spend. If it is, you're going to go on a benchmark cap. So let me give you an example of that. In Qualubel, we had 25,000 patients. That was the ACO that ran the first 6 years. We had 25,000 patients. We had about a $250 million book of business. So that was the total cost in that patient population. If we had been a high rev system and we were at risk for that population, we would have had a cap that was either 1, 2, 4, or up to 15% of that big number, that $250 million number. If you're a low rev system, you go off a revenue cap. So in a low rev system, we would have had about $22 million worth of spend in Qualubel, and we would have paid 2%, 4%, 8%, and 15% of that smaller number. This is a huge difference. This is going to drive most big Part A systems out of the risk models in ACOs because it's a huge amount of risk. So it's important to understand. The final rule basically points the direction. By the way, there's no increase built into fee-for-service and Medicare, and of course the other payers follow that. Penalties for high-cost MIPS and APMs, bonus amounts less than inflation after 2 years. If you got more than 35%, nearly all health systems are going to be penalized under this new model. And then all major payers and employers are currently following suit to move to value. In North Carolina, we just found out that Blue Cross Blue Shield expects to put all of their Blue Cross Blue Shield contracts into a value-based contract within the next 5 years, which is shocking because most people have about 60% of their money comes from really 200% of Medicare Blue Cross Blue Shield fee-for-service contracts in North Carolina. So it's going to be a major, major impact, different in every state, the way that's going to roll out. But this is both an opportunity and a risk. And don't think that what I'm saying is negative. It's sort of factual in the sense that there are opportunities here, I think, to be part of the program that actually brings a lower cost service to some places where we're probably spending way too much money. We can use some of that money on other things we really need to do inside of our system without really reducing care and maybe, probably improving care from what it looks like. So, okay. Do I still have some time? Yeah, okay. I want to talk just a minute about the mission and kind of where the mission has to come from, where the force of this thing has to come from, right? Because the government knows where it comes from. If you look at who they attribute lives to in an ACO, you'll see where they're pointing at this thing. It's pointed directly at physicians. It's pointed at them because they've been given the power to do it by society. by their patients, by their education and their training. And they're probably the only ones that actually can cause this to happen in any reasonable way without the government just coming in and making a program that says you have to do it. This was identified, it was quoted back in 1980. It's something we all know. When we all went to medical school and we went to our interview, I remember it well, and they asked me why I want to be a doctor. I didn't say because I want, to balance my work life, or, that I wanted to have shift work, or I wanted to have 9 to 5. Those are all very important things, and I expected to have them. I expected to have high salary and high status when I went to medical school. But that's not what my answer was. My answer was the right answer that got me into medical school, and it's the one we all made. It's the one we all had to feel in our hearts to even want to do it, which is we wanted to be of service to others, and we wanted, go into healthcare to be part of a solution for people and be part of their healthcare model. So the practice of medicine is an art. It's not a trade. It's a calling. It just isn't a business, and it can't be business first. If it's a business first model, we're a labor union. If we're thinking about ourselves, we're a labor union. If we're thinking about patients, we're a profession. And as a profession, we care about our patient. We care about each other. The reason I have a good work-life balance is because of my partners. That's how I have a good work, because I'm on 24/7 for my patients as an OBGYN. But if I have good partners and we work together, I can balance work life and do a great job for my patients too. So it's about together. It's about the profession sticking together. That's what we need to make all these responsibilities and duties we have. Society gave us the keys to the car, but in a sense, we all have to work together to get it to run. It's a calling in which your heart will be exercised equally with your head. We all know this. We all remember learning all the rules and whatnot around sort of our ethics and our morals, but also these are the guys that were developing a lot of the sort of basic understanding of how you do medicine at the time. I think it's important because the professional model of care has been somewhat restricted, our ability to execute it. And maybe it's less here than in a lot of places, but in some places it hardly exists at all. If you go to downtown Charlotte, you'll find almost no independent doctors. Everybody's in a system where somebody else picked their EHR, somebody else decides where their referral base is going to go within whatever the proprietary model is. So I think the other thing this points out is that, we like to think, and I think society likes to think, that medicine is this big, giant scientific machine, and that patients are parts and pieces, their hearts and their lungs, because that's what we've developed, right? We've developed specialties that really know these things and siloed our care models into them. And so I think society likes to look at it as a big factory. There's a big factory and somebody breaks a piece and they go in the factory and some specialist fixes the piece, they come out the other end. But we all know, anybody who actually takes care of patients know it's more about the relationship that we have with them that causes the outcome of their health care to be great. It's because we have time and energy to think about what's going on with them, get them to the right people, not just have them be parts and pieces or in a factory. So professionalism has been identified as a critical piece, this sort of idea that doctors are the solution. And when I say doctors, I don't mean to separate that from the systems that are support. It's a place where the patient gets their health care from somebody who's unconflicted and has a duty to put them before other things like their financial interest. We all have to run our businesses. And this is a new offer to us to really be able to go back to, we have good status, we make plenty of money, society wants us to, but we also put our patients first and can. I also just wanted to mention physician burnout. I don't know how bad, I expect it's bad here, just like everywhere. There's sort of this hamster wheel thing that fee for volume drives. This change of value is critical for us too. It's critical for me, for sure, and for our practices. This is where we get to go back to having a practice that's not just about how many patients we can see in 15 minutes. I got really good at that because that's how I got paid. But this other model where I get to spend time and energy thinking about my patients is far better for me and for our profession than the other one. Physicians are now, I think, on the top of the list for suicides in the United States, and patients identify healthcare costs as the major reasons they file bankruptcy. It's a call to arms for us as a profession. You're in a profession as a calling, not a business. It's a calling which exacts from you at every turn self-sacrifice, devotion, love, and tenderness to your fellow men. Once you get down to a purely business level, your influence is gone. The true light of your life is dimmed. And it is true that you cannot execute the value in a model where it's just a business. And that's been shown over and over again. Trust and duty really matters, and these are the two things that have been identified as critical. The relationship between a patient and the system has to have trust in it, or the patients won't respond to the engagement around the value-based model. So building that relationship is part of what this talk about professionalism is. It's not just talk. It is about what we should be doing, but it's also about how you get the result. You get the result by building the relationship with your patient. The quality of the patient-physician relationship had the greatest effect on patient engagement. A 1-unit increase in the measurement of quality of interpersonal exchanges led to a 10-unit increase in the level of activation by the patient. Patients with higher scores were more likely to monitor blood pressures, exercise, adhere to medications, and do other things. It's just critical. And if they hear different things from two different sides of the authority equation and they're not sure which one is unconflicted and trustworthy, they'll do none of it. They'll just disengage, which is what happens in our most complex patients usually. Okay, so professionalism defines the solution to value. You guys probably remember when the first news broke about the ridiculous differences in the cost of medical care in two cities in Texas that were not very far apart. And at that time, the Institute of Health went in and did a big analysis. And what they reported was that payment reforms has to create incentives to encourage behavioral changes at the locus of care. It's at the provider-patient interface. And how do we do that? How do we make that easy? That's what we're going to talk about. The rest of the group here is going to talk about what you have to do that. But this is, and it's been on the books for a while, and it's built into every model that CMS has put out. This idea that doctors, or in a sense, that unconflicted duty has to be the solution. This is a cartoon. It's pretty old, and I'm sorry the colors are a little distracting here, but this is what we're talking about. Form leads to function. So in the old model, what we had was patients connected to everything on this outer ring. So see this as sort of 3 rings around the patient. The outer ring is pretty much everything that currently considers itself directly related to a patient without any intervention. I know in a lot of the big systems on the East Coast, if you ask the healthcare system whose patients these are, they'll say, you know, this is Banner's patient, or this is Novant's patient, or this is Atrium's patient. They don't say this is the doctor's patient, or the patient has a doctor. They're thinking about these as widgets in a gigantic factory, and they're thinking that they're customers of a system. So all of these guys have customers. And no matter whether they're nonprofits, for-profits, whatever you want to say, they're all thinking about patients for the most part as customers on this outer ring. That's why this sort of central picture, and I didn't do a great job of kind of making the point, but this little white insulating area is supposed to represent, is supposed to represent an insulation of professionalism. So it's supposed to bring this back to a value-based relationship. In the middle, you put a patient. Around the patient, you put a common record. Around that, you put everybody who's caring for that patient. I put physicians up here, but you can see, I mean, these are specialists working together, they're care teams working together, the front office staff, the back office staff, the business people. It's a new mindset with the patient at the center. Patient-centric care is it's a code word for professionalism. It's a code word for putting the patient first and having it be the first thing. And then outside this insulation are the partnerships. And they currently are the profit centers. In the future model, they become budgeted cost centers. They can make good money. There's still plenty of money in medicine. They're not going to make 18% return on their investment in the value-based model, because that's part of the money that we have to take back out, and it's part of the reason that they're not going to particularly like this change, and they haven't responded very well to it. But really, everybody's out there, so that's the idea that you create, and if you create this, you'll get a 3 to 5% improvement in your ACO scores if you don't already have it, and you guys may already have it here at SERPA. So now we get on to the pillars of value, because I told you sort of the three of us in my mind kind of represent the pieces of the pillars. What do you actually have to pull this off? First, you have to have the platform. It has to be a provider-patient relationship platform that builds trust, builds communication, builds things that happen coordinated with a single message. You know, Blue Cross Blue Shield really shouldn't be calling your patients and telling them to get their mammograms unless they're identifying themselves as from your office as part of the overall scheme of things. So you have to have a platform that's competent to have that unconflicted point of view for patients. So you're not doing the things you really don't have to do, or shouldn't be doing, actually. The data infrastructure, and I would say this one actually comes first. It's the center pillar there. It can hold up the roof really by itself. If you have this, you will get a significant improvement. It has to not only impact the administrative people, it definitely has to do that. It has to have penetration into the care coordinators, the front office staff, the nurses. It's designed to not be intrusive. It has to be designed to not be intrusive. But it also has to point to the point of care, the place where the patient meets really that trusted relationship they have with, in the end, the captain of the ship, which is the provider. It has to be fairly complete, so you have to spend a lot of time getting the data in that you need that tells you real time where patients are, and that's what we've tried to develop here. Obviously, it has to have a low barrier to entry. It has to be cheap enough for people to do. And then the last piece, and Wesley's going to talk about the data infrastructure and how we do that. The last piece is the value-based contracts, and that's what SERPA is. So you guys get that one. That's for sure. You get together, you combine, you figure out how to do these value-based structures together. It's an ACO, it's a TIN, it's a CIN. The thing to understand about them is they all stack. They can all stack together. So you can have a model that then becomes part of a bigger model and a bigger model and a bigger model. So you can pick out your efficiencies as long as you don't violate the basic rules. The basic rules are, unless it's a very small hospital with a very low Part A, for the most part, you can't have hospitals being measured in your ACO models because they will throw your ACO models off. You pick your other people that are around the perimeter there based on what they bring in value. I'll give you the example that's easy to understand. So if you have, let's say we had a big proprietary POL lab, so we had a big lab that we did a lot of our reference work at, and we were big, so we could make money. We could charge 100% of Medicare for the lab. We get paid 120, so we made some money. That seemed like a good idea in fee-for-service. In fee-for-value, it's a horrible idea because there's two major mature markets for lab in the United States, and they both can make money at about 50% of Medicare. So in a value-based world, you're talking about knocking an entire percent off the spend by not being in that business. And that's part of what this is about. You don't want to be in businesses where you can't generate the economies of scale. You want to partner with those businesses, partner with the hospital, partner with the lab company, partner with the home health company, partner with those outer rings. So data is the first step. I think Wesley's going to come back after we take a break at lunchtime and start this off. I do want to suggest to you that there's a 30% delta here. So it's a $3 trillion spend in America, and $1 trillion of it is avoidable. $1 trillion of it's on the table. They're not going to take that trillion away. The government's not going to keep it. They just want to keep paying $3 trillion for a while. They want us to do the job of sort of making this happen. So the question is, how do we get this other trillion identified? How do we think about it? This is a picture, and you guys may know this picture. During World War II, they would send squadrons of bombers out, and they would have a shoot-down rate. And they would get the planes back, and they would spend a lot of time, and they were very efficient at patching holes in these airplanes to get them back into the air again. And the question came up of, we need to put some metal on these airplanes. You know, airplanes don't do well with heavy metal on them. So let's put some metal on them if we can, but let's put it only in the perfect place. So we want to get engineers, and we want to get all our statisticians, and we want to get all the data on every single airplane that's ever been hit by a bullet that we have, and we want to put it on a picture. And this is actually the picture, that the original picture is pretty much like this, about where these bullet holes were. And then they brought in engineers and they said, tell us where to put the metal, because we know we got to reinforce some of these areas that are just obviously being beat up by bullet holes. And they came back and they said, we understand what you want to do, but you've missed the point. The point is that where there's no bullet holes, that plane never came back. Because there's no reason to believe that those spots where there's no bullet holes didn't get hit by bullets. They did, and they just were shoot downs. And they took this analysis and they literally went through and said, where is the place where no plane ever comes back if it gets hit by a bullet? And put a piece of metal over it. And they kept working at that until they got all the metal on the plane could reasonably fly with, and they reduced their shoot down rate by 30%. So this is what data can do for you. This is what having this data. If they hadn't had the data, they could have never done that. So we're gonna talk about data, because I do think it's foundational. We don't have enough data to know how bad it is. I'm shocked when I see the data that somebody tells me about how our health system compares to other health systems. And I know I'm shocked because I'm blind, because I'm just not seeing the real pieces of this. I have good intuition, and I see it with my own patients. I'm not seeing how we can fix it, and you do start seeing it. We've had the data systems in place now long enough that we really do know where to put the pieces of metal. And the pieces of metal are things like extensivist clinics and having stratification in your pools. They're the things the government are telling us we need to do. They're actually trying to pay us to do it. Data blocking, or the interference with data, is part of the resistance to change. And you'll see it as we bring, I know we're going to bring one partner up here, you already have it. You're going to see it, and we need to work together to stop that. That's not patient-centric. Patient-centric is we have secure, confidential data. We're not going to use it for any reason except for patient care. We're going to use it together in the same environment it's always been used in, which is a doctor-patient relationship. And it's going to give us the data that we need. So this is from the Institute of Medicine that was in that original report on McAllen, Texas. And they said, they basically said, look, we actually know. We actually do know. Even back then, we knew what needed to happen. But it's just not enough. And somebody has to do it. Somebody has to apply this. And it's not even being willing to do it. You just have to do it. So this is stuff that, you know, I guess I'm the messenger today of the pillar of mission. And I know we all have it, but I think the context of it now is that, you know, knowing is not enough and willing is not enough. Wesley's going to come back after we break for lunch, which is, I guess, coming up, and we can have some questions after this as you want. What he's going to talk about is how to put the data platform in, what the updates look like, how all the stakeholders get it, how you stratify patients, how you identify opportunities for improvement, how you improve provider workflow so that the hamster wheel doesn't get worse, and then how you report. So, okay.